In a world where good comics are made into bad movies, three nerds with their Overstreet price guides at the ready fight to educate you about the truth of the best comic book stories. The hour of comics is upon us with hosts John Seymour, Keith Bliss, and Jason Gurin. I always try to record before anyone gets here, but man, all of you are so prompt.
It's because we've been waiting around for you.
Yes, of course. Blame the guy who is late. I hope you all had a wonderful day so far, and you're ready to have an even wonderfuler day.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Very much so.
Okay.
Wonderfulest day.
The wonderfulest day of all. So today we are talking about that notorious story, the comic story arc from 1992 to 1993, the death of Superman. We are only talking about the first part of the story, the Doomsday part, because that's when, the death of Superman actually happens. Beyond that, it's more like the death of Superman happened already. So now what? So today, regular panel, we have Keith Bliss. How are you?
Doing well, as always.
As always, and you live by the beach as always.
Yep, sun's
Unless-
out, buns out,
Unless anything's changed, I don't know.
No.
Jason Gurin,
What's up, fellas? How's it going?
how's it going, dude? And today for the first time, we have a special guest in Kyle Bain. How are you,
Hello,
Kyle?
hello. I am
Woo!
fantastic. I have never read a comic book before, so I'm excited for this.
How have you never read a comic book?
I didn't like reading growing up, and then by the time I got into reading, I became an English teacher, so I had to read longer things.
That were not comic books. I got you.
I think they would frown on teaching comic books in English class in high school.
I think it might depend
Depends.
on what kind of class it is. If it's like a first grade class, that could be like a cool like.
Well, so I
They're
did
graphic
teach.
novels, man.
I was just gonna say I did teach a graphic novel of Macbeth this past year, so maybe
Cool.
that was, I guess, the first comic book that I ever read.
Yeah, you're unwittingly you're actually having like a discussion that's very popular among comic book fans of like, is it actually a first appearance? Was that actually the first comic you read, or is this the first comic you read? Because it's like, would you call that a comic book? I don't know. Anyway, well, I hope you did enjoy the death of Superman. And my warning that
Enjoyed
is
to death.
yeah,
It's kind of morbid.
that is like I gave Kyle a warning that it is incredibly simple, and it's like, if you think it's too simple, that's because it is. It's just such a simple story that exists because Clark Kent and Lois Lane were supposed to get married, and there was like this whole big thing that happened, and there was like a show, and it was supposed to coincide, like the wedding in the comic was supposed to coincide with the show, and they were like, yeah, well, you know what, we got to scrap that idea. And so they had like a year's worth of scripts that they just kind of had to toss off to the side, and they were like, you know what, let's just kill off Superman. It was a joke, but then they said, you know what, let's kill off Superman. And then they actually went ahead and they did it. And I had mentioned that it's a very simple story. Normally, I have notes about what happens throughout the story, but this one is 7 issues of basically a giant monster with bones growing out of his skin is running rampant and destroying everything in his path, and eventually gets to Superman. And that's pretty much 7 issues worth of story right there.
Yep.
Hey, Keith.
Hello.
Sorry, I thought you like ran away.
I did screaming. I couldn't believe Kyle has never read a comic book.
Yes, and that's why you muted yourself. I understand. That was clever. Well, I was also going to say that Kyle has never read a comic book in the same way that I've never seen an episode of Star Trek before I was brought on to do the Star Trek podcast. It happens, So anyway, why don't we just get right into this Superman story, 1992 to 1993, with the exact dates escape me, but you know, it's a 30 some odd year old story, so here we are. Keith, I'm gonna bug you because you were muted, so I wanted to like give you some extra work.
I'm fine with that.
What was your like your overview of this Superman, the death of Superman story?
Well, it was kind of crazy because I remember watching the news, and it actually made the top story or something on the 10 o'clock news on UPN 11. They were talking about like, Warner Brothers has announced that they're killing Superman, and like they had fan reactions. They went to comic book stores. Like it was that big of a deal. It's kind of crazy that it made it to the news. That's how like popular and ingrained Superman is in society. So I do remember actually seeing that on the news, and I went and bought. I actually have two copies of it, one sealed and one opened. Um, it was an interesting read for that time frame because they never killed anybody other than Uncle Ben and Batman's parents. So the fact that you're killing one of your titular characters in such grand over the top fashion was kind of a big deal at the time. And to read it, it was a little bit of a long-winded story. I get it because it took place over several issues, but seeing the ramifications of Doomsday just kind of mow everything down. It was just this force of nature that killed literally everything, had no qualms about it. Just, all right, look, there's a deer, snap. Oh, there's this, snap, truck, punch. Literally nothing. He did not blink. There was no remorse. Even when he ran into the Justice League, they were like, this guy is just a beast. We don't know what to do with him. He has just one thought on his mind, murder and survive. And it was just kind of crazy that at that point in time, they had never really run into a character of that nature. You can say, Darkseid was a really strong villain, but at least with him, there was a level of reasoning or logic behind it. He was, on the other hand, just a pure force of destruction and didn't care. And it was the immovable object meets the immovable force.
Right.
So the fact that Superman could finally kind of like break loose, because he's always said that he's had to hold back to a certain extent. Otherwise, he's going to punch somebody hard enough that they explode. So he's always had to kind of measure his punches and pull them to a certain extent. And this was the first time he really kind of like truly broke free and went just kind of crazy, and knew that if he didn't stop this, force of nature, nothing was going to, because he was or is technically the strongest being on Earth. So at the time, Martian Manhunter and a lot of, Wonder Woman were not put on the same pedestal as Superman. So in the 90s, it was Superman was your measuring stick of strength. And the fact that he struggled and the end result was he eventually getting killed was very, meaningful and traumatic. Granted, it only lasted like 12 issues and he came back, but that's how we got Superman with a mullet.
Yeah, and sadly, I know what you're talking about. It is funny with this story because they were saying that they wanted to kill off Superman to regain fandom, regain the fans' attention, and they were saying we don't want to use kryptonite. So, you read the story, you go through it. Kryptonite is never even mentioned, and
Nope.
it's actually it was a really clever thing because they were like, okay, we're gonna kill off Superman, but if we make it too obvious, well, fans aren't gonna fall for that. They're gonna be like, oh, sure, they use kryptonite. Yeah, that's like a blow to the dick. Fine, okay. But I thought it was really clever the way that they did it. As simple as the story was, it was the direct result of Superman's popularity kind of waning. And, so hey, how do we bring back fandom? We kill off Superman. How do we kill off Superman? Not the obvious way. So let's create this new Doomsday guy so that he can kill Superman. Jason.
So I have to say, I haven't read this story probably in about 20 years. I did pick it up the morning it came out. I was probably in like my heyday of comic collecting at that time, 14, 15 years old. We were kind of anticipating this issue. I remember waking up super early that morning and going to You didn't have to go to comic book stores back then. You know, stores that sold newspapers had comics. So
Yep.
I got in there. I remember before school biked
newsstand
in, got my
issues.
stuff,
I'm sorry.
wait to read it, and then I mean, the whole storyline, like you said, it's so simple, and I feel like reading it now, it's like almost harmful to myself. Where like 14, 15-year-old me loved it. It was so aimed at me at the time. I was so invested. Now I read it and I was like, all right. I mean, I don't know. There's so many just funny things you could just poke holes in now, I guess, after reading so many years.
I guess it is a comic book. You know, they could get away with a lot of stuff in comic books. So, Kyle, you have never read a comic book before, and now you've read what is arguably the most notorious of the comic books. And please tell me if I'm wrong, the other two guys. It is among them, if it's not the most notorious. What did you think? What was your experience reading these books?
I have so many thoughts.
Good.
With it being the first comic that I've ever read. So growing up and not reading comics, I mean, like, I was a nerd that didn't read comic books. I had friends that read comic books. I still have friends that read comic books. But all I knew about comic books, or was told about comic books from outsiders, was that they're very simple and they're for children. So that was my idea always about what comic books were. So this was an interesting one because it both reinforces that idea and makes it really easy for me to get into it because I have no frame of reference at all. I mean, with all the comic book movies that have been out recently, I have some idea of who some of these characters are, like Booster Gold, and I happened to read it the morning before I saw Blue Beetle, so I sort of had some frame of reference there. But I like that it's simple. I like that it's straight to the point. And like Keith said, it's the first time that, like he said, it's the first time that he's able to let loose, that Superman's able to let loose. And that was another issue that I've always had with the DC characters compared to the Marvel characters. Again, I don't have a huge frame of reference, but I've always been told like those DC characters are unwilling to kill for the most part, at least.
Right.
So I really enjoyed that this was far different than what I had expected. There's parts of the writing that I think are a little cliche, and then there's parts that I think are fantastic. I love the parallel between the Justice League fighting Doomsday and the Cat Grant interview. I think that piece is fantastic.
That was so good. I thought that was incredible. Yeah.
Yes. I could picture it in a movie, like it's being very cinematic. And then so we talked very briefly about how the comic book ends with the picture that's on the cover, and that kind of took something away from it for me. I was just anticipating that being the end, and I mean, they very literally title it "The Death of Superman," so I was expecting nothing other than that. But I think it's fun. I mean, I think it was an interesting first read for me because it, like I said, it sort of reinforces what I've been told for years. And then on the flip side, it's an easy way into comic book reading for the first time.
Yeah, you're the third guest now that I've had on who is not like a regular comic book reader. I've kind of made the mistake. The first one that we had on was Greg, and I just kind of gave him like the most tedious, boring read, and that was a mistake. I'm now any guests that I have on who have not really read comic books before, I want to give them something a little bit more interesting, and that's why I
appreciate that.
Yeah, I know this was a good one, and like you said, that second issue with the Justice League, with the interview happening on the top and the Justice League story happening on the bottom, sort of like simultaneously. It's sort of like it skips like up, down, up, down, up, down. I thought that was really cool the way that they did that. And me now, when I started reading, now the last time I read this was in 1993, and what was I? I was 10 years old at the time. I didn't really understand that it was just a kind of I guess a means to an end. They're like, oh, we're going to put this story together and we're going to make everyone like wonder what's going to happen, because they didn't call it The Death of Superman as the books were coming out until the actual book where he died came out with the ripped cape on the flagpole or whatever that is. Now I look at it and I read it. When I started it, it's this kid. It's just this kid who's saying like, "Oh, my mama was kidnapped by monsters," and he's like, and then he decided, "Oh, you know what? They killed her, but I can still call Superman and he can help." And then that just never came back. And then there was this kid, Mitch, who had his story where he's like, "Oh, his house got destroyed by Doomsday," and he's like screaming and calling for Superman, and then that never came back. And then the story was just about Superman fighting Doomsday. I'm like, okay, at least with like the long-haired punk kid, that was relevant to the story. I just didn't get, and maybe Keith or Jason, maybe you can explain. I didn't get the whole underground monster story. Why was that there? Do you know?
It was more just to show like a progress of time, sort of
Okay.
like how the story opens up with Doomsday punching out of wherever he was locked up. You're showing how we got to this point. Well,
Right.
this is the day in the life of Superman. This is the stuff that was going on, and then he has the interview that goes on for a short period of time, and then he leaves, and then he goes and starts beating the crap out of Doomsday. This is just like a progress, like what Superman did on the way to death kind of scenario.
All right.
I kind of looked at that like a juxtaposition. Like you had these dopey villains in the beginning, they don't speak very well, and then all of a sudden, like
The
they're
mole people.
yeah, he just wipes the floor with them. They're nothing, and then you had that juxtaposition to Doomsday. So I think it makes him look that more, more incredible and dangerous.
Yeah, I was just saying that they wanted to balance out the villains. I thought.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Villains at the beginning that easily taken care of, and that's nothing. But here comes the main course.
I would go as far as to say, and this might be a bit controversial, but I'll explain it. Doomsday is not really a villain. And the reason that I'm saying that is because, yeah, he's this driving force that just destroys everything, but there was even a scene where what's her face was like trying to control his thoughts, and she wasn't able to do it because he didn't really have any thoughts. He was just like he was just a weapon. He was just like boom. It's like calling the iceberg that sunk the Titanic a villain. It's like, yeah, not really, is it? Because yeah, Keith.
Well, in a story after the fact, they explain his origins and
he does get
yeah, it gets flushed out eventually. Basically, what happens is he's a hyper evolved being from Krypton. They basically, some crazy scientist millions and millions of years ago, wanted to create the perfect survivable being. So this scientist sent this creature to a planet, and it kept dying and resurrecting, and it kept evolving. So eventually it just got to the point where it evolved to where I just need to survive. I don't care what I come against. I'm going to evolve to get past that. So that's why when you see the opening panel, he's got a glove on and he's punching, and then you slowly start to see the bones protrude. It's because that's his body adapting to that barrier or that blockage of whatever. And that's kind of like you notice as he's progressing, he doesn't change very much until he runs into Superman. At that point, you start to see the bones evolve a little bit more and protrude more, and his costume eventually peel away.
That's one of my favorite thing.
Yeah, right. Where he slowly starts to like peel and expose.
Like Justice League, and they give him everything they've got, and all they really managed to do is unlock his other arm.
Yeah, right. They gave him more power.
Yeah.
Who's with me on saying that Doomsday was actually creepier when he was in that rubber suit?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. It's like,
and all he did was laugh.
Yeah. All he did was laugh. It was like, hey, look, he's in a rubber suit, and then the rubber suit comes off, and he looks like, someone's grandfather. There's like white hair and whatever, the bones protruding out. Now, I want to talk about something. Now, this, for me at least, is a recurring theme of the simplicity of the story. Now, to me, what I picked up on was that it wasn't so much about, like, yes, it was about the story, but it wasn't about the story so much as the presentation of the story. Now, maybe you noticed this, maybe you didn't. In the last 4 issues, which would be 4, 5, 6, and 7, In issue 4, every page was 4 panels. In issue 3, every page was 3 panels. Well, I'm sorry, 5, every page was 3 panels. 6, everyone was 2, and then in 7, every page was a splash page,
Yep.
which was really cool. The way that they presented it that way, almost like a countdown, like a foreshadowing. And also just like the art, like the way that everything was shown in the beginning, everything just kind of looked like frumpy cartoons. And then as it progressed, the more and more it progressed, the more intense the art actually got, which I thought was really cool. Do you guys notice that?
Yeah, absolutely. The last issue was such a fast read with all those splash pages.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that, and it's funny that you bring that up because I was talking to our listener, Rick, and he was talking about the artwork on some of these stories that we've reviewed thus far. And this last issue is like the quintessential story because everything's a splash page. Every image, you're like, okay, it's really intense. Like Superman holding a helicopter over his head with Lois and Jimmy, and then him flying off, the goodbye kiss. A lot of these were images that, were splashing all over the news where you see the flagpole with his cape, the things where he's, different scenes where he's fighting Doomsday. That was a big deal. And that's, they wanted to show you that. They wanted to reinforce that, like, this is the focal point, not like, hey, what's going on over here in this, third floor of this building? It's literally this.
And in that last issue, every page being a splash page, and then the last, like, whatever 7 or 8 pages were like, they didn't even have borders. It was just sort of like, hey, now we're really getting to the bare wire. And that was really cool.
I have a question for you guys.
Sure.
Because again, it being the first time, I don't fully understand how this is laid out. So you guys keep referring to them as issues.
Flip pages and you read the next one. You flip another page, you read the next one.
It's sort of like, that's okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry.
But so like I noticed that it was broken up.
Yeah.
So were those released at different times, or was it all released as one
Correct
piece?
There were several issues that were released that built up to this, and then they had this graphic novel, The Death of Superman, where they took all of those issues and condensed it down. That is, what John was talking about. And if you notice, the artwork changed because each issue was a different story and a different artist at the time, so it was a little different based on everything.
Through about 3 or 4 comics
I'm sorry.
I think it was like
4 books, I think, or at least 3 books.
What? Wait.
Man of Steel and Superman.
It was here. I have it right here. Man of Steel, Adventures of Superman. We got one that's just called Superman, Justice League. Yeah, so it is. It's 4 and Action Comics.
And so 5.
Action Comics. Yeah, that was. And Keith, I'm sorry, Kyle, to answer your question a little bit more, is because all of those issues were released at the same time. I think that this was released over only 2 months. And if anyone's listening and says no, it was more than that,
I think it was like every week or so another one came out.
Yeah, it was only 7 issues. So if they
right.
And since these were kind of like parallel to each other, like they probably had 2 or 3. So it might have been like a month and a half or so, or 2 months, something like that.
It was 1 issue a week. Jason, you're right. You're right about that. It was.
For quite some time.
For several issues, Superman was trying to fight Doomsday, and he basically what he was doing was that he was kind of keeping him at bay. He found one weakness in that he wasn't actually able to fly. So he says, as long as I'm able to keep him up in the air, I can stop him from doing maximum damage. And then he realized that when he punched his bone, like the bones that were protruding, he's like, oh, that actually hurts him. And it's just sort of like, why wouldn't that be the first thing you try? Like his bones are literally sticking out of his body, and you're just like, oh, let me try punching his face or his skin, and I'm like, his bones are like everywhere. So on the one hand, I feel like, why didn't he try that sooner? But on the other hand, I feel like that's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina. It's just sort of like, okay, well, we need to end this. We need to wrap it up. Let's find a weakness so that they can punch each other to death. and we can have the iconic image. I felt like it was a bit of a cheap way to end it, but all in all, I thought it was a great story and like very well presented, and that's my opinion.
Fair.
Okay.
Definitely enjoyed it. But like I said, I don't know. I guess just the older me didn't like it as much as the younger me did.
Well, and you got to remember that's with age. You go back and read this when you were like, I was 15 or 16 or something like that when this came out. So reading it then, you're like, oh, this is cool. This is amazing. And like for Kyle, this is the first time he's ever read it. So yes, you're an adult, so you have your adult experiences behind it, and you can see plot holes, especially because you're a teacher and you're trained to look for those things.
Like maybe if it wasn't the bootleg Justice League and they had the Flash and Batman and Wonder Woman, they could have actually taken this thing down.
Well, see, here's the thing though. In the New 52, they do a rehash of this story. They even come out with the Death Man and then Superman versus Doomsday, and they've had different iterations. They've had this iteration of it, and then they've had the New 52 version of it, and he still basically beats the crap out of him because it's the power creep issue. So if he is supposed to be the immovable object and Superman's the immovable force, regardless of whomever other characters he's up against, he's always going to be that much stronger than whoever it is. So even if he's going up against Wonder Woman, she's going to beat the crap out of him, but he's going to evolve, adapt, and then eventually he is able to take her at some point. And the same thing with the Flash. I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't take much to screw up the Flash. It's a little black ice or a vacuum of space, and he's screwed.
I thought Batman would have.
Like you see him like moving forward and then getting sucked back. Just like, whoa.
Yeah. So that's scenario. So they have rehashed this story with the newer iterations of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, the New 52.
I have to check that out.
And Rebirth. And they've also had a couple of movies of this. We've coincidentally reviewed them on that other podcast I sometimes am on.
You'll have to tell me which one that is.
I mean, I forgot the name of it, so I'll have to go look it up again. It's some obscure little thing. But yeah, we've actually watched those on that show.
Okay.
And we've reviewed them just a couple weeks ago, actually. So it's still very fresh in my brain.
Kyle, do you have any other things that you would like to say about it?
Like I said earlier, I kind of disliked the fact that Superman was always supposed to be this wholesome individual, like always very by the book and wouldn't kill anybody. And I liked that I liked that there was, the instances where it was very different. And by the end, he realized that he had to kill Doomsday. But seeing, his wholesome personality play out in pictures was kind of interesting. I enjoyed seeing it this way because it wasn't, the incredibly dark Superman that I got in like Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman, which is, really my only frame of reference in terms of Superman, because you guys are going to hate me for this. I watched the original Superman maybe 10 years ago and I hated it.
Which one, the Return of Superman? Or you're talking about like Christopher Reeve Superman?
The original Christopher Reeves.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. I actually watched it a couple of years ago myself, and I was sort of like, man, when you're older, this movie looks like shit. So yeah, like I get it.
And then there was just things that I had certain expectations going in, and they were sort of thwarted in ways that I didn't expect. I didn't expect to, like you guys mentioned, love the fact that it's not Flash, it's not Wonder Woman, it's not Batman. It's all these, I guess, sort of obscure characters. I don't know where they stood in the grand scheme of comics at that point. But like, I know that like Guy Gardner is going to be the Green Lantern in the upcoming DCU. Like that's the only reason I know that he exists is because of the media now. So it was cool, like seeing those, and it was kind of, I was like able to like pat myself on the back for knowing that these people existed. But no, again, my expectations were thwarted in a lot of ways, and it was better than I expected. With my expectation being this is for kids, and then seeing them beat the crap out of each other for the duration.
It's funny you should say like, I always avoided comic books because like now that I'm older and et cetera, comic books are for children, X, Y, and Z. You know what, man? Some
Not
of
at
the
these,
story. I'm sorry.
not at these prices these days.
Yeah, but some of the stories that I've read, like whatever era, 1940s to 2023. That's not an actual year, but you like they like had their violent days. Like comics used to be super violent. Then they got super campy and now they're violent again. So um yeah, there is a lot of not child friendly stuff that happens in comic books. And
Mhm.
I think that people don't seem to understand that just because it's a cartoon, it doesn't mean it's for children. Like I imagine you wouldn't put like a 4-year-old in front of Family Guy or something like that. It's a cartoon, but it's not for children. This is not quite as inappropriate as Family Guy, but kind of, adults can really appreciate the stories. They are well written a lot of the time. Some of the time they're kind of crap, but uh I would say that literally don't judge a book by its cover. And
Mm.
truly, you see that like shredded cape on the flagpole. One would say, well, this is for children. I really don't see it because it is a dramatic image and it is not for the faint of heart. So, you know, that's my take on it. So I'm actually glad that you brought up that you thought that comic books are for children because it's a very common thing for people
Mhm.
who don't read comic books to say until they read them. And then like, oh, actually, this is kind of not for children. Like so
Queens,
I'm sorry, what?
Queens, maybe. Like
Yeah.
the 11-year-old range is where
Mhm.
start off.
But so also, I had mentioned that I read the graphic novel of Macbeth, and that was purely by accident because I have students that hate reading, and I was just trying to figure out a way to teach them Shakespeare because I like Shakespeare. Um, and I think that is a great bridge between, what's considered great literature and then the comic books that people don't often consider great literature because it's very obviously, I mean, it's people being murdered for, hundreds of pages.
Mhm.
And it expresses that it's not just for kids. So I think had I not read that this past school year, this may have been a harder sell for me. But it was nice to see something familiar to kind of ease me into it.
Okay.
You should check out, I think they still make it. There's a Beowulf graphic novel
Ah, yes.
Okay.
you
I
should
love
check out.
There's
love
there's
Beowulf.
everything. There's is that what did you read the No Fear?
Um no, it was no, I forget who made it. But it was very literally a graphic novel. It wasn't the No Fear where there, it's
No.
modern.
There's No Fear comics
Oh, okay.
of the same thing. Yeah, there's I think it's only done with like Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, like the big ones, but they
Sure.
do exist. So yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So that's pretty cool. Um,
We'll have to do that on one of our episodes. We'll bring Kyle back.
bring Kyle back.
Yeah.
We'll talk about Hamlet and
I'm in.
Macbeth. Awesome.
Yeah.
Sweet.
We'll do the
Um,
Beowulf one because I've read that one.
Okay.
oh, sure. Make it easier for yourself. Make me have
Why
to
not?
make me have to do work.
John,
think
newsflash, I read the Superman one too 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So it's not like this is a first read for me here.
Yeah, well, so did I, but I was not able to really kind of
Great.
I wasn't able to go based on my memory of having read it.
Oh, heck
Anyway,
no.
Yeah, my
No.
recall wasn't there. I had to reread.
there were a few pages where I was like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that, but for the most part, I kind of didn't remember pretty much any of it. I just remembered the Doomsday destructive path guy, and I remember it being a lot more violent. But you know,
Are we going to
It-
continue the reign of Superman?
we need to go to funeral for a friend first.
Well,
And
one long.
I may just kind of stop it at this one. I don't know, depending on how popular the episode is, depending on how much we enjoyed it. I have not read Funeral for a Friend or The Reign of Superman, only the Doomsday story arc.
I started to fall off during the Reign of Superman, but I did read his official return. I remember when that came out.
Nice, nice.
Again, mullet Superman.
The mullet Superman, yes. So
DC
anyway,
Life
I'm sorry.
with Batman a couple months later.
It's true they did. The
You know
mullet
what?
was a big fashion thing in the 90s.
What was actually also kind of,
Where Bane broke Batman's back. They capped that off right after Superman. They're like, oh, we killed off this one.
That is true.
Let's do another one. It brought in the money.
What was also kind of funny is that based on the popularity of this Death of Superman episode or comic story arc, they started killing off all the DC characters, to get them to be more popular. And, so I guess that about covers it. Any closing words from anyone?
Well, I have one more question for you guys.
Okay.
So I noticed that they reference like issue 68. Is there this overarching story of hundreds or thousands of comics to read in order?
Go ahead, Keith.
So yeah, this is it's kind of a slippery slope because these were stories plucked out of an overarching comic book series. They were referencing other stories in that series. So it'd be like, well, issue 42 of Action Comics, and it's because of whatever. They don't have to necessarily read that issue 42, but if you want to know what they're referencing, that's the point you go back to. You don't necessarily have to read all 972 issues, just literally issue 42
That's the one, yeah.
and whatever the reference is. Like there was one for another episode we did where it was with Spider-Man or something like that, with the Fantastic Four, and they're like, oh, read Spider-Man issue 96 because of the buggy, and you're like, okay, and it was just some other rando reference, and literally it was like one panel of that story. So you don't necessarily need every single detail like this. With Doomsday. They didn't explain it until way after the fact, like years and years later, his origin. So like the way this opens up him on Earth, they explain how he got here because they couldn't control him. They contained him. He crashed here when it was primordial Earth and he was in the core, and just shit happened. He eventually got free, but you don't know that when this story starts. It's like 20 years later or 30 years later, they finally actually explain it.
We actually have a new Doomsday book coming out tomorrow, which I don't know, by the cover alone,
apparently there's a Doomsday story coming out tomorrow.
I think he's in hell or something.
Oh, that's fun,
I'm kind of interested about that one. It looks kind of cool. I didn't know about that.
Add that one to my pull list.
So long story short, Kyle, you don't necessarily need every single tie-in if they give you the core story. So like the story I referenced with Watchmen, that is a self-contained story. They have brought it into the DC universe probably 5 or 6 years ago. But the original Watchmen story, you literally pick up the graphic novel, everything is in it, you're good to go.
Okay.
And
very cool.
Basically what they do, this was a big thing in comics, like, in the earlier days, before there were like comic databases that you could just pick whatever story you wanted to read and just it was right there for you. They would make references that were not actually like necessary to know about, and they say, oh, well, we did this and now it's sort of like part of the story, and they have like a little asterisk and they're like, oh, in this issue number whatever, just so you are like, okay, now I'm caught up, not so that you're like, well, what the hell are they talking about? They're like, oh, okay, this was in a previous issue, fine, and if you happen to have access to it, cool. Likely though, you're not going to have access to that book that they're talking about. So that was how they informed you of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So cool. Awesome. I like
Bricks, by the way, makes the OCD collector go and find issues that they don't normally go and find.
Yes.
It was from personal experience. Wait, what happened there? Oh, I gotta go find that.
Let me find that one. Yeah, so read the trial of Magneto, where they are just like talking about
every other page, something references
that
something.
he did. Find all those issues and read all of them. Come back and talk about them on the show. Anyway, I I guess that about sums up the Death of Superman Part 1. Maybe one of these days I'll go and read Part 2, and we'll talk about that another time. But as for right now, Keith, you said something about like a movie podcast.
Oh yeah, this little side project. We have like 100 or 200 episodes, nothing crazy. It's myself and a mutual friend of ours, DJ Nick. It's called In Happiness and Darkness. We talk about superhero movies, anything really kind of that's been based on a comic book graphic novel. In this week's case, we're doing Death Note, so it's going to be manga.
Nice.
So we are a very diverse group. We have guests. Kyle, one of the days we'll have you on our podcast, I promise you.
I'm in.
I don't know what we're going to review, but it'll be something. So, like last week we did.
I love
Blue
when you
Beetle.
review something.
Hey, we're game for everything. We have reviewed Highlander. We've reviewed, like I said, Death Note. You pick it. Guyver. All kinds of movies, as long as it is rooted in comic books or anime, manga, graphic novels of that nature, we will review it. So, like I said, it's myself, DJ Nick, and potentially a guest of some sort. You've been on it, John. You can check us out on all the major platforms: Spotify, Apple, iTunes. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. It's Happiness in Darkness. It's a black and red image. And you guys drop a comment. I'm always game to talk about anything comic books and movie related.
I do appreciate that you're game to talk about comic book related stuff. Like,
it'd be really awkward if I didn't, because I'm on this podcast.
You've been on every single episode, and you're mentioned in the opening. What do you even call that thing?
The opening, just the opening.
The opening, yeah, okay. Okay, Jason, where do people find you?
Well, you can find me on Facebook, Jason Gurin. Come to Comic Book Villains, one of those sites that we run over there. And then, as I mentioned last time, we've got a new up-and-coming thing for anybody who's on Discord. We have a free Discord server called Comic Book Addicts. And it's annoying, but here are the numbers for it if you want to look it up. It's discord.gg/3MV J97J75V. And it
just rolls right off the top.
Different servers within it where you could monitor different comics that are coming out. We've got a bunch of different sites that you could just kind of click on and see what's coming out over the next several months. A lot of good spec stuff in there for people into that.
You know what you should do? You should get like Siri to say those numbers, and then people might actually remember them.
Yeah, well, well, you can just find me on Facebook, message me, and I'll send you the link.
Jason, that's Jason Gurin, everyone. Gurin. Anyway, Kyle, what about you? You tag me in every one of your podcasts, and I love it because hey, I'm so glad to see that you put out as many episodes as you do.
Well, I just enjoy doing it, so you guys can find me at Bain's Film Reviews on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. My website's name is Bain's Film Reviews. My podcast, which was primarily me interviewing indie film directors and writers and things like that. And while I'm still doing that, I'm now also just chatting about movies that I like and doing little offshoots of that with friends and family. So it's really enjoyable. So again, that's Bain's Film Reviews at YouTube, Spotify. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. And as for me, John Seymour, JON space SEYMOUR. That's me on Facebook. I'm sitting behind a drum set wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt. Whatever. I don't think you need more description than that. I'd be amazed if there was another John Seymour on Facebook sitting behind a drum set wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt. So anyway, that's me on Facebook. Obviously, you're listening to The Hour of Comics is upon us right now. I also have another show called Bullshit Hour with John Seymour, which has kind of been a bit inactive as of late because, I don't know, scheduling.
Ran out of shit to talk about.
I ran out of shit to talk about, man. Like it's now there's no bullshit anymore. It's and
too much bullshit to cover.
And that might just be the new bullshit. So anyway,
the serious hour.
The serious hour, the stone face hour with John Seymour. So let's talk about
Deadpan with John Seymour.
Deadpan, yes. Anyway, So that's my other podcast, Bullshit Hour with John Seymour. I'm also semi-regularly featured on Greg Vorov's podcast. That is Star Trek: The Undiscovered podcast. I am on episodes Space Seed and The Wrath of Khan, and you can also hear Kyle on that episode, The Wrath of Khan. And Kyle, you're also, if I understand correctly, you're going to be on the next movie episode.
Yes, I am.
The Search for Spock, I believe, is the name.
I believe so. Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock.
The Search for Spock. So you can find us there and, listen to Greg Vorov's other Star Trek The Undiscovered podcast episodes because, it's a lot of fun to listen to. And he always has really great guests on. It's always very entertaining. And I guess that's about the size of it. And for now, I can say good night, Keith. Good night, Jason. And good night, Kyle. And
good night.
Whatever
good night,
time
gentlemen.
it is, whatever time it is you're listening to this, have a nice one.